Welcome to ATSA's back channel, expert conversations about sexual abuse, treatment, and prevention. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Drs. Jackson Tay Bosley and Dr. Judith Zatkin on dating skills and healthy sexuality. Dr. Jackson Tay Bosley has worked in the field of sexual violence prevention for over 40 years. He obtained his undergraduate degree in religion from the University of Hawaii in 1978, master's degree in psychology from Antioch University in 1982, and his doctorate in clinical psychology from Rutgers University in 1999. He has engaged in direct clinical service, program development and evaluation, taught in university settings, researched effective responses to sexual violence, and testified as an expert witness in numerous cases. He recently retired from operating a program for Title IX students at Princeton University. Dr. Judith Zatkin is an assistant professor of psychology at Bemidji State University, Northern Minnesota. She has a doctorate in applied social and community psychology from Portland State University and sits on the ATSA Executive Board of Directors as the Prevention Chair. Her research interests center upon preventing sexual violence and abuse in organizational settings, such as on college campuses and within youth-serving organizations. She's also interested in understanding how cultural perceptions of sexual violence perpetuate and facilitate it. Dr. Zatkin teaches undergraduate courses on human sexuality, sexual violence prevention, social psychology, and research methods. So welcome, Tay and Judith.
Hello.
Okay. Hello. All right, so we are set to talk about dating skills and healthy sexuality. Now, it seems that healthy sexuality is it's quite a mystery. It's one of those things that we don't know what it is until we see it, perhaps. How would you, given your work in this field, how would you define healthy sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do think it can be loaded, but to me, it's also simple in some ways too, right? And to me, it's a willingness to have conversations about sexuality. It's a willingness to advocate for your needs, and it's a willingness to listen to people that you want to have a sexual relationship with and take their needs into account as well. So to me, it really comes down to good communication skills and good conversations, as well as keeping an open mind and thinking about new possibilities and kind of doing what you can to get rid of a lot of the shame that sometimes comes alongside with sexuality, right? We know that a good sexuality and a good sex life is an important part of our development. So kind of taking the stigma away from talking about sex, which can lead us into healthier sexual relationships long term.
And I think we know more about what's not healthy sexuality than what is healthy sexuality. I think it's like Judith said, it's really hard to describe. I mean, we all have these kind of urges, not we all, most of us have urges to be sexual with other people. And when that is expressed in some kind of way that is very comfortable with the other person and we feel very good about our sex life, we usually feel better about ourselves as people. And I think it kind of helps kind of the world go around, so to speak, that interactions keep happening. But it is complicated, and it involves learning, and it involves a whole bunch of things that I think most young people are not prepared well for doing. At least in my experience of the college students that I've worked with, it is obviously troublesome for them, and they don't do it well, which is part of the reason I think there are as many kind of unhappy sexual interactions on college campuses as there are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when we think about like sex education in a lot of high schools, particularly in the United States, you're maybe getting contraception and STI prevention, it's very unlikely that you're getting much conversation on consent, on healthy sexuality. And then you go to college and it's kind of all like, okay, now we're going to talk about consent, but you don't really have the skills to even start thinking about that. And it can feel a little mind-blowing and scary for people who aren't used to having those conversations.
And I think a lot for the high school level of sex ed is often what I call the plumbing.
Yep.
You know, it's just, it doesn't talk about, you know, the affective part about it. Do you like people or do you not like people? How do you communicate that? How do you work out some kind of a negotiation about what type of sexual behavior is going to be okay or not? None of that is ever mentioned because I think it frightens. I don't know if it frightens the students. I think it frightens their parents. So, but it is the kind of thing that I, at least on the college campuses, I see students coming in and they're woefully unprepared for the incredible opportunity of not having any adult supervision, having free access to alcohol, and being in a situation where they're interacting with tons and tons of other people and having the kind of situation that could be sexual or not, but you know that where that is a potentiality.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's an interesting forum for young people to kind of learn about being sexual, about falling in love, about you know, or not being sexual without falling in love. So there's, you know, a lot of learning to be done.
It's really interesting from different cultures how it seems that the more open the culture is about sex, like the sex huts of northern Cambodia, where the girls are in complete control over their sexuality. There's plenty of like ritualistic like flirting, and then the girl can take the boy back to her hut and it's up to her and what happens. And if the boy misbehaves, his social life is ruined, so they don't. All the way to the other side where sex is such taboo that there's all kinds of like a pressure cooker that, you know, the steam just goes out in every direction and you get highly pathological or problematic behavior, which we saw in Afghanistan with the circle of men that would end up abusing boys. And in our previous conversation, we had a similar information about some communities in Israel where the genders are completely separated and there's all kinds of taboos. So perhaps being a little bit more relaxed about it, it's the way to go to be able to talk about it.
Yeah. And I think that on the typical American college campus, right, I see kind of two stereotypes or norms as being particularly harmful in healthy sexuality. And I'll talk about gender in a binary sense for now. I do want to acknowledge that gender is more than a binary, and that's another big problem in the way that we often talk about this. But when we talk about heterosexual sexual relationships, oftentimes women are expected to be both sexy and pure at the same time, which can lead to a lot of like flirting without wanting to have sex and not wanting to be perceived as a slut or be perceived as easy, but still wanting to be appealing. And then men are basically told that they're not supposed to want anything except have sex all the time and have as much sex as possible, which both of those can lead to kind of a really harmful interaction, as we can see, and kind of, I think, set the stage for a lot of like miscommunication and campus sexual assault. And they're really hard stereotypes to break down because everybody wants to be perceived positively by their peers, especially when you're an emerging adult and you care more than anything about fitting in. And when you're governed by those stereotypes that may not define who you are, it can feel really not so great. I can definitely see how they impact campus conversations.
And I think that there's a kind of a natural evolution in, you know, what I use the term courtship because it really does kind of encapsulate a lot of these dating skills, social skills, a lot of that kind of stuff. But there are evolving courtship norms. And what is okay and what might have been okay for our parents is solely wrong for young people nowadays. Now, you don't want to tell the parents that because they're going to go, oh, no, 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 they should follow what I think is the way they should be. But young people will not. They will do what they think is correct and what is more socially acceptable in their peer group. So it's interesting to me that we're watching this kind of evolution. One of the things I noted, certainly with the students, the Princeton students that I was working with, where so many were telling me about their Tinder profiles. Now, I'm an old person. We never had any of that kind of stuff. It was much more complicated to meet people, but apparently it's very, very common. And even amongst my gay identified students, I would say, well, where are you meeting people? They're meeting them on Tinder. I said, not Grindr? Yep. No, Tinder. I said, oh, okay. Well, it shows you how little I know about what's apparently happening now. But it is a kind of a complicated new norm for determining who you like, who you're attracted to, and what you're going to do next. And that is certainly much more difficult, or maybe not difficult, but it's definitely different than, when I was younger and we would go to bars or we would go to parties and hope to meet somebody. And, it was a different kind of potential social arrangement that led to interactions.
But
I lived through that shift, right? So when I started college, online dating was still kind of perceived as like weird. And then by the time I graduated, it was becoming more and more normal. I'm a mid-millennial, right? So I graduated college in 2013, and I would say about half of my close friends at this point met their significant others on Tinder or a similar dating profile. And those norms, again, we see some of those gendered norms kind of still sticking around, where it's more expected. Like, as a woman on Tinder, a heterosexual woman on Tinder, you get like thousands of matches, right? Everybody is just like, yes, 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 yes. And then you can kind of just wait for someone to approach you. So we see some of those older tactics like replicated even into new forms. And then you also have, I think, young people who are trying to figure out how to break out of those norms, right? Because they know they don't want to be defined by like these gendered courtship norms that their parents went through. It's really interesting.
But then you start the communication via text, right? Which is a whole different ball game than actually going up to somebody and try to have a conversation with them.
Yep. And a lot of people are on Tinder just looking for sex, which, again, that's fine. But the way that it's like done is comments on people's body parts are really explicit first messages that I think particularly a lot of women are getting. I don't think it's only women, but it's really jarring to be looking for a date and have somebody message you like, this is how big my penis is. Do you want to see it right away? Right. And you're like, oh my God, like what is going on? It's a common experience for, I think, college-aged women who are trying to date online. And, it kind of puts that barrier of not anonymity because your picture is still associated with your profile, but you might not say that to somebody's face the first time you meet them, where it's easier to type it out.
I've met people. But I mean, it amazes me. Why not just say, I'm looking to date and have sex?
Right.
That's it. No penis pic.
Right. Yep. Just don't send it's like, I think of it. So I teach human sexuality, and we were talking about paraphilias and exhibitionism. And I asked my students if they thought like sending an unsolicited genital picture was exhibitionism or not. And they were kind of debating back and forth because like, what's the purpose of sending that, right? Are you trying to get a shock reaction? Are you trying to show off? If somebody asks for it, obviously that's the purpose, is that they've asked you for it. But if you're just kind of sending that as your first point of interaction.
Does it ever work?
No.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know why people still do it. It doesn't seem that it would work.
Yeah. Maybe there's exceptions to every rule, but I would say as a rule, no, that's not a good way to find a date.
Well, one of the things I think that is kind of unusual and different is that people are now more overt about their reasons for dating. We used to kind of be unsure because we didn't talk about it, but was this a purely sexual interest, or was it kind of a more romantic, oh, I really like you as a person, and are we going to form a relationship kind of thing? And now people are saying, nope, I'm not looking for that. I just want to get it on. Oh, okay, well, I understand that, but that's a different way of kind of communicating, certainly, than I did many, many years ago. That might have even been the case, that we were just looking for sex, but most of us never, first of all, never said it. And second of all, it was always kind of through what I consider more subtle messages, more body language, more non-spoken things. And now people are being much more verbal. I'm going to text it. Oh, all I want is sex, and this is the kind of sex I want. Oh, okay, I understand that, but it is kind of unusual, I suppose, for us old people, maybe not for young people.
Well, I think there's something positive about it, right? Like expressing what you want and what you need. Like I am looking for a relationship versus I am looking for casual sex. I mean, then I think people can make a choice, because really when we talk about healthy sexuality, it's about communicating your needs and making a choice to sleep with people whose needs match yours. And putting it out, honestly, I think is a positive thing. And there is also a big difference between writing in your Tinder profile, hey, I'm on here because I'm just looking for casual hookups, versus being sexually explicit in your first message to somebody, right? It's possible to be looking for a casual hookup and still be respectful to the person that you're hooking up with.
Well, one of the complications to that, I think, is that sometimes people motivations change in the context. Yes. So if I would be in one of those meeting somebody and being sexual with them, if I had great sex, for example, with them, I might be falling in love with them. Oh, they're really a wonderful person on top of being great at sex. So if you start out, oh, I'm only looking for sex, it's kind of like, does it nix potentially changing into a more emotional relationship, or is that already set? I'm sorry, no, this is what the rule is.
The kids call that catching feelings. Okay?
Catching feelings, yes. Yeah. Catching feelings, yes.
And you caught feelings, and I mean, generally, it is complicated, right? And any relationship is complicated. It's almost like consent in general, right? Just because somebody says, like, yes, I want to have sex with you, they're still allowed to change their mind halfway through. They're allowed to not like it, right? And be like, hey, stop, or do something differently. So similarly, it's got to be an ongoing conversation, and it can be embarrassing when you said you wanted casual sex, and then I'll use the term catch feelings, and the person doesn't have feelings back, and that's a bummer. That young people unrequited love is always a bummer.
Do you find any I don't know, one of the conversations from sociologists studying sex among college students, one noted that men who have like hookups kind of like express some desire for more of an emotional connection. But again, it may be that kind of like not being permitted to show that vulnerability and having to be the player.
Yes, I think that goes back to one of the stereotypes I was talking about earlier, that particularly in college, the expectation is that young men are supposed to want to have as much casual sex as possible. And I'm young and free, so I'm going to be young and free until I'm tied down. And that might work for some people, but for other people, like, it should be okay to express that you have feelings that are romantic for somebody if that's what's developing, right? But when you want your friends to think that you're cool, you may not admit that out loud.
But I mean, even the language, I'm going to be free until I get tied down.
Yep.
It's like, are you being kidnapped?
Literally. Like, I'm young, gotta YOLO. No, they don't say YOLO anymore. That's when I was in college, but
I don't even know what that is.
You only live once. YOLO.
I have a 14-year-old. I don't know half the stuff that she says. My wife translates. So what are some things that get in the way of healthy sexuality? What are some factors you think?
I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things. I think that societal expectations for men many of those haven't changed. I want to be a stud. okay, I kind of understand you wanting to do that. What does that mean? And there's all of these kinds of things that go along with that, including not being emotional, being constantly ready for sex, and being a great performer. Okay, no guy wants to hear from his partner, oh yeah, you're lousy at this. Oh no, that would be crushing. But that is in fact what a lot of guys are kind of fearful of, and it's that part's not talked about usually. I also think that there are these changing norms that guys are not, they're struggling with it and they don't know. I mean, just the whole notion of what we've mentioned, what you mentioned, Judith, is consent. you know Folks of my age, we knew what consent meant. We know what the word meant, but it was never discussed. It was never processed. It was all implied and, assumed or not, depending on the circumstance, based on those much more ephemeral kind of nonverbal cues. But nowadays, people are being more overt about it. I don't know if what I said is that all of my Princeton students could define consent, but I don't know if they had, the skills to actually, make sure that there was consent. Or if that were the case, they wouldn't be by clients, because that's who I was seeing. So I think that complication remains. I think it is a little bit more difficult, a little bit easier in some ways, because I know at least at Princeton, there was a huge orientation session based around you must have consent, you must have consent. So at least the students came in and they were going, yeah, we've heard about this consent thing. Well, they got a bunch, they got a big dose of the education. What they didn't get is how to actually make sure that consent was there and that it was ongoing. Often it was, initial, yeah, I'm willing to go out with you for a drink, and the guy's thinking, oh, she's going to get it on with me, she or he. We again, Judith, I'm going to say what you said, that we live in this kind of heterosexist society, but that's not everybody, and it's certainly problematic. One of the other problems I see is that people have expectations that often are very unrealistic. Some of it is from watching porn that has a notion of sex that people don't have problems in porn with sex. They just jump in, do it, and do it 100% correctly. Well, that's not realistic. Most of us kind of stumble around a little bit in the process, and hopefully we end up doing something that our partner likes, and that's returned. But I think that the expectations of, I mean, many years ago, I remember people saying, what's the big danger of porn? And I thought, and at that time it was Playboy magazines, that was porn. And the issue, as I said, if all guys expected their partners to look like Playboy playmates, they're going to end up really disappointed, because those are not normal people. Those are not, that's an unusual, that's not a normal sample. That's a very skewed sample. So I think that the expectations can make it tough for people to kind of be okay with, a less than stellar sexual experience, and then learn from that to make it better. So what do you think, Judith?
Yeah, I think that on college campuses a lot of times, and this was kind of discussed in the book Sexual Citizens by Hirsch and Kahn, is sex is seen as like a commodity almost. Like the more people who want to have sex with you, the cooler you are, right? And like being desired is, the kids will talk about body count, right? How many people you've slept with, and like a higher body count might mean like you're more in demand, right? And that does lead to, I think, a weird notion of it, right? And as well as like the romance behind movies too, this belief that if you just are like a nice person and do the right stuff, the hottest person in school is going to want to sleep with you. Maybe not, right? And then as well as like, porn shows that you can just start having sex without worrying about any foreplay, without worrying about lubrication, and that it's not supposed to hurt, it's supposed to feel good the first time. And we know that that's not really the case. So when you
Yeah.
have all of these expectations of what this beautiful sex life is supposed to look like, where you're sleeping with a lot of people and it's always amazing, and that's not really what the reality is. Yeah.
I think this would be a good moment to show this public service announcement from New Zealand. And I'm very happy that neither of you have seen it, so we can get a raw reaction of it. So without further ado, I will introduce this. I'm hoping that this will show. Okay, so you can see this?
You can.
Yes.
All right, so here we go.
Hiya, I'm Sue. This is Derek. We're here because your son just looked us up online, you know, to watch us.
Matt! Matt, darling, there's some people here to see you. So he watches you online?
Yeah, you know, on his laptop.
iPad, PlayStation,
His phone, your phone.
smart TV projector.
Yeah, anyway, we usually perform for adults, but your son's just a kid. He might not know how relationships actually work. We don't even talk about consent, do we? No, we just get straight to it.
Yeah, and I'd never act like that in real life.
Hey, Maddie. You right?
Okay, Sandra, stay calm. You know what to do here.
All right, Maddie. It sounds like it's time to have a talk about the difference between what you see online and real-life relationships. No judgment.
Many young Kiwis are using porn to learn about sex. Keep it real online. Get help and advice at keepitrealonline.govt.nz.
What do you think?
That's amazing.
That's good. That's good.
So good.
Yeah. Well, and I like the fact that it's presented to the parent, because the kid is kind of, I think sometimes they realize, I don't know if this is really what happens in real life. The parent is going, oh my God, you're being sexual. You have this, because parents want to think their kids are not sexual, and then they go out and they get married, and then something happens, but we don't know. They end up with grandchildren. But
Sure brought them. Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does a really good job of showing that like porn and sexual content in media it's fantasy, right? And that's not just like the porn or sex genre. I watch a lot of Game of Thrones, right? Got sex in there, but it's a fantasy genre. Or like Law and Order SVU is a show that I enjoy watching, but it's nothing like actually working with sexual violence prevention or legislation in real life, right? So understanding the difference between what is meant to entertain and what is meant to be real is a really important distinction.
these are not documentaries.
Right.
Yeah. There's no David Attenborough narrating.
I think this is a really good time too to think about like who porn is for, mainstream porn anyway too, right? Like lesbian porn a lot of times, or porn where two women are having sex, is generally meant for men. They're like having sex in ways that I don't think lesbians generally actually do have sex if it's not made for lesbians. So talking about ethical porn use too, right? Like finding stuff that's treating the performers equitably and people are getting paid for and is done with everybody's consent is another important part of that conversation. There
is feminist queer porn is the one that is the most equitable and focuses on the woman's satisfaction. This is from some research that I don't know exactly what to think of. Like, I guess the researchers watched a lot of porn and rated it, which certainly must have been really interesting to be in their office in the universities watching porn.
Yeah.
I have this vision of them getting caught watching porn. And, I'm doing research. Oh, have to apply for a grant now. So, all right.
Yeah. Well, I when I was working at my previous job, I was looking on and created a folder on my desktop that said porn sites, CITES, because I was keeping track of all of these things. And I was reported by the IT department, oh, look, this guy's doing something terrible. And I had to explain, no, this is, this really is research. But
I'm showing a video in my human sexuality class in a couple of weeks, actually, when we talk about like sex work and the pornography industry. And the woman in this video describes like Pornhub porn as like McDonald's, right? You know, it's like, it's a quick fix. It's not necessarily good for you. It's not real. It's like full of garbage, but sometimes you're still going to eat McDonald's, and kind of compare that to like looking for more ethically sourced porn that is more realistic. And if you want to be an ethical porn consumer, those distinctions can be important. I thought it was an interesting way of putting it. I'd never heard of it like that before. And I was like, that's an interesting analogy.
yeah.
So how can teens, young adults, develop healthier sexuality?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit and say practice. They have to have interactional relationships that involve somebody else. If it's a, shared sex with somebody else, they need to kind of talk about it. And Judith, I really agree that if they're not communicating about it, you don't know, what's going on and what they like or what they don't like. And now I look back and said, back in the old days, we often didn't know. I mean, it was, we guessed, and hopefully we were, that our heart was in the right place and not trying to be, exploitative or anything. But that's one way of kind of doing it. And certainly, I think that kind of our social norms and social ideas, Judith, you mentioned, people who grow up in environments where, very strict kind of rules, taboo rules about what's sexually acceptable or not. And those keep running into the reality that those are not followed. Oh, yes, we have these very strict rules, but nobody follows them. Well, that's a problem. That's a problem because it causes all kinds of internal cognitive dissonance and guilt and, I'm going to masturbate. And then, how many times before I actually go to hell? Is it a mortal sin or a venial sin if you're from a Catholic environment? So there's all of these kinds of things that I think are conflicting. And when I saw the students come, to Princeton, they really saw a very, very different kind of social norm at that in the college setting than that they were used to prior to that. And it was and remains a shock, I think, for college students because they are, in fact, going to experiment around with sexuality in ways they never did before.
Right. So I like to think about sex education starting young, right? And not in the way that we would think of like not professional, but like teaching that no means no to kids at a very young age, right? If you ask somebody if you can give them a hug and they say no, you don't give them a hug. And that might mean like letting your kids know if their wonderful grandmother or aunt or uncle wants to pinch them on the cheeks, it's okay for them to say like, oh, thank you, right? And those boundaries should be respected. And similarly, teaching little kids to respect other people's boundaries too, and that they don't always get what they want. That's a good lesson for things outside of sex too. Yeah. And then as kids grow up, like making it so that the only conversations they're having about sex aren't like Googling boobs and seeing what comes up on the internet. I don't know what kids do these days, but having open conversations and making it like acceptable to talk about sex growing up, and then moving to consent, thinking about consent as a process, right? So I have a actually scale that I published with my colleagues Alyssa Glaze and Keith Kaufman about thinking about sexual consent as a process instead of as like a gatekeeping strategy. So like the items evaluate whether or not people think consent is about checking in with your partner, communication, and then we also have a reverse coded subtle coercion. So avoiding things like, well, if you really loved me, you would just do this because I want to do it, right? That kind of communication isn't necessarily what I would think of as this process-based consent. None of that is going to be like a magical silver bullet that's going to fix sexual violence forever, but I do think it's a good step. And it kind of involves like shifting some cultural norms, right? From a really young age, which is hard to do. And thinking about dosage, right? Like kids are learning about sex from a variety of places. They're learning at home, they're learning at school, they're learning from media. from their peers. So how are we kind of correlating these messages as much as possible too?
And also, even prior to that, the social skills to be able to interact.
Yep.
I think that's a major issue too, with people not being able to like connect with those with whom they're interested.
Yep. Yeah, I did another study with my colleagues Alyssa Place again and Tessa Dover, and we looked at Reddit posts of involuntary celibates, so people who identify as incel is the term that's used. And what you see there is a lot of people, men specifically, who have really warped ideas about what sex is, about what relationships are, who really buy into this, like, either she's a pure perfect beauty or she's a slut, but also have no idea how to actually interact and form a relationship. And that combination of these really, really strong gender norms and roles about, sexual purity as combined with not knowing how to interact it's a dangerous place to be. And it doesn't really serve anyone because it doesn't lead to fulfilling sexual relationships. And that mentality can lead to violence. We've seen that, right? If you look at the Isla Vista shooting in Elliot Rodger, his whole manifesto was about how sorority girls didn't want to sleep with him. So, yeah.
Oh, well, on that note, we come to the end. There is hope. There is hope. I see. Let's end on a positive note. I do see with my daughter's friends, she's 14, some glimmers of hope. I mean, they're still kind of like the boys that are heading into the very traditional gender norms and that, but also we see more emotionality from the boys, more physical affection with one another, which hopefully will lead to them having more emotionally rich relationships just with one another.
Absolutely.
And hopefully that would help as well.
And gender norms are breaking down too. We're seeing more and more young people identify as non-binary. We're seeing gender become more fluid. And we're seeing these really strict stereotypes start to alleviate a little bit. I work with young people every day. And frankly, I work with young people in rural northern Minnesota. And we're seeing that even up here, that people just have a better idea about what gender is, healthy sexuality. I think that we are seeing shifts toward positive changes, which is a good thing.
And one of the things I note, certainly from the feminist movement from many years ago, women are now saying, no, I want this, or I don't. It's always been, I don't want it, because that's the expectation. But now more and more women are saying, no, I want it, and I think that that's a healthy thing. Recognizing sexual desire and acting on it is nothing but healthy. The trick is, of course, to do that in such a way that, doesn't, conflict with, somebody else's freedom to be whoever they are, but also not get stereotyped in some kind of way. And one of the things I noted was that there wasn't the kind of slut shaming that I grew up with back in the 70s. I graduated in the 70s. So the expectations for women were much more along the lines of the whore Madonna syndrome and, some other kinds of real negative things, which are not happening now, or happening much less, I think.
They're happening differently, right? I think it's a much more subtle, pervasive, we know we're not supposed to see that, but I do think that we still do see it in more subtle ways. But also, so studies done by folks like Terry Conley have shown that men and women actually have similar desires for casual sex when women know that the encounter is going to be pleasurable, when they know that they're going to be safe, right? They're not going to be forced to do anything that they don't want to do, and they're not going to be called a slut afterward. So if those three things are guaranteed, then their gender differences between desire for casual sex actually do kind of go away, right? So, but those three things are still happening, and not just to women. I think that people of all genders can get sexually assaulted, right? That's important to talk about. And really important to build resources for men who've been sexually assaulted, as well as men who've been sexually assaulted by women, because that can and does happen. But, breaking down norms as much as we can and recognizing these more subtle, pervasive things that come up in media that maybe aren't as obvious as they were, but are still present in some ways.
Well, I want to thank you very, very much. It has been a pleasure, and I hope that the audience is able to think a lot about this topic and this conversation.
Thank you. Always a pleasure talking with you both. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to visit ATSA.com.